Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Spirit, culture and its realm of actuality. Continued. The noble consciousness, being the extreme, which is the self, appears as the source of the language by which the sides of the relation are shaped into animated wholes. The heroism of silent service becomes the heroism of flattery. This vocal reflection of service constitutes the spiritual self-separating middle term and reflects back into itself not only its own extreme, but also reflects back into this self the extreme of universal power, making that power which is at first only implicit into a power that is explicit with an existence of its own, makes it into a self-consciousness individuality. The result is that the spirit of this power is now an unlimited monarch. Unlimited because the language of flattery raises this power into its purified universality, this moment being the product of language of an existence which has been purified into spirit, is a purified self-identity, a monarch. For such language likewise raises individuality to its extreme point, what the noble consciousness divests itself of as regards this aspect of the simple spiritual unity is the pure intrinsic being of its thinking, its very I. Expressed more definitely, it raises the individuality which otherwise is only a presumed existence into the existence of its pure form by giving the monarch his own proper name. For it is in the name alone that the difference of the individual from everyone else is not presumed, but is made actual by all. In the name, the individual accounts as a pure individual no longer only in his own consciousness, but in the consciousness of everyone. By his name, then, the monarch is absolutely separated off from everyone else, exclusive and solitary. As monarch, he is a unique atom that cannot impart any of its essential nature. This name is thus the reflection into self, or the actuality which is the universal power, has in its own self. Through the name, the power is the monarch. Conversely, he, this particular individual, thereby knows himself, this individual, to be the universal power, knows that the nobles not only are ready and prepared for the service of the state power, but that they group themselves round the throne as an ornamental setting, and that they are continually telling him, who sits on it, what he is. The language of their praise is in this way the spirit that in the state power itself unites the two extremes. It reflects the abstract power into itself and gives it the moment of the other extreme, the being for self that wills and decides, and by so doing gives it a self-consciousness existence. Or otherwise expressed, this individual actual self-consciousness attains to the certain knowledge of itself as the power of the state. It is the point of the self into which the many points of selves, through renouncing their own inner certainty, are fused into one. Since, however, this spirit proper of state power consists in its obtaining actuality and nourishment from the sacrifice of action and thought by the noble consciousness, it is an independence that is self-alienated. The noble consciousness, the extreme of being for self, receives back the other extreme, that of actual universality, in return for the universality of thought which it relinquished. The power of the state has passed into the noble consciousness. In it, the power is first made truly effective. In the being for self of the noble consciousness, it ceases to be the inert entity which it appeared to be as the extreme of abstract being in itself. Considered as it is in itself, state power that is reflected into itself or has become spirit simply means that it has become a moment of self-consciousness. That is, it exists only as superseded. Consequently, it is now essence in the form of something, the spirit of which is that it is to be sacrificed and surrendered, that is, it exists as wealth. It does indeed at the same time have a continuing existence as a reality, vis-a-vis wealth, into which it is ever changing in accordance with its notion. But it is a reality whose notion is just this process of passing over by way of the service and honour done to it, and from which it derives its existence into its opposite, into the relinquishment of power. Thus the peculiar self, that is its will, knows that through the debasement of the noble consciousness, it has become a universality that renounces itself, has become a completely separate and contingent individuality, which is at the mercy of every more powerful will. What remains to it of universally acknowledged and incommunicable independence is the empty name. While, therefore, the noble consciousness behaves as if it were conforming to the universal power, the truth about it is rather that in its service it retains its own being for self, and that in the genuine renunciation of its personality it actually sets aside and rends in pieces the universal substance. Its spirit is a completely disparate relationship. On the one hand, in a position of honour, it retains its own will. On the other hand, it gives up its will, but in so doing, it in part alienates itself from its own inner nature and becomes utterly at variance with itself, and in part subjects to itself the universal substance and makes it completely at variance with itself. It is dear that as a result the specific character which it was judged to have in comparison with what was called the ignoble consciousness. Just a minute, there's a typo there. I'll start again. It is clear, I should say. It is clear that, as a result, the specific character which it was judged to have in comparison with what was called the ignoble consciousness has disappeared, and with it the latter too. The ignoble consciousness has achieved its purpose, namely, to bring the universal power under the control of being for self. Happy families. I wish I knew what it was like. Self-consciousness, thus enriched by the universal power, exists as universal beneficence, or is wealth which is itself in turn an object for consciousness. For although wealth is for consciousness the deposed universal, the latter has not yet by this first subjection returned absolutely into the self. The self has not yet for object itself qua itself, but the subordinated universal essence. Since this object has only just come into being, consciousness has formed an immediate relation with it and thus has not yet exhibited its disparity with it. We have here the noble consciousness, which preserves its being for self in the universal, which has become unessential, and therefore acknowledges the object and is grateful to the benefactor. Wealth already contains within it the moment of being for self. It is not the selfless universal of state power, or the naive inorganic nature of spirit. It is state power which wills to hold its own against those who would take possession of it for their own enjoyment. But since wealth has merely the form of essence, this one-sided being for self, which has no intrinsic being of its own, but is rather the cancelling of it, is in its enjoyment the essenceless return of the individual into himself. It therefore itself requires to be ensouled, and the movement of its reflection consists in this, that wealth which is only for itself develops an intrinsic being of its own, that instead of being a cancelled essence, it develops an essential being. It thus receives within itself a spirit of its own. Since the form of this movement has already been set forth in detail, it is sufficient here to characterize its content. The noble consciousness, then, is not related here to the object as an essence in general. On the contrary, what is alien to it is its own being for self. It finds confronting it its own, but alienates itself as such in the shape of an objective fixed reality, which it has to receive from another fixed being for self. Its object is a being for self, that is, its own being for self, but because it is an object, it is at the same time ipso facto an alien reality, which has its own being for self, which has a will of its own, that is, it sees self in the power of an alien will, on which it is dependent for possession of its own self. Self-consciousness can make abstraction from every particular aspect, and for that reason, even when it is tied to one of them, it retains the recognition and intrinsic validity of itself as an independent being. Here, however, as regards the aspect of that pure actuality which is its very own, namely its own I, it finds that it is outside of itself and belongs to another finds its personality as such dependent on the contingent personality of another, on the accident of a moment, on a caprice, or some utterly unimportant circumstance. In the sphere of law, what is in the power of an objective being appears as a contingent content from which it is possible to make abstraction, and the controlling power does not affect the self as such. On the contrary, the self is acknowledged. Here, however, the self sees its self-certainty as such to be completely devoid of essence, sees that it is pure personality, is absolutely not a personality. The spirit of its gratitude is therefore the feeling of the most profound dejection as well as of extreme rebellion. When the pure I beholds itself outside of itself and rent asunder, then everything that has continuity and universality, everything that is called law, good and right, is at the same time rent asunder and is destroyed. All identity dissolves away, for the utmost disparity now occupies the scene. What is absolutely essential is now absolutely unessential. Being for self is now external to itself. The pure I itself is absolutely disrupted. Therefore, although this consciousness receives back from riches the objectivity of its being for self and supersedes it, it is not only like the preceding reflection, incomplete in principle, but is conscious of not being satisfied. The reflection, in which the self receives itself as something objective to it, is thus a direct contradiction. Indeed, the pure I itself, qua self, however it stands, at the same time directly above the contradiction, it is absolutely elastic and therefore again supersedes this supersession of itself, rejects this disowning of itself, which would make its being for self into something alien, and rebels against this reception of itself, and in this very reception is conscious of itself. Since then the condition of this consciousness is linked with the absolute disruption, the distinction within its spirit of being noble, as opposed to ignoble, falls away and both are the same. The beneficent spirit of wealth can further be distinguished from that of the consciousness receiving the benefit, and has to be considered separately. The spirit of wealth was an essenceless being for self, something to be sacrificed for others. But by imparting itself, it becomes intrinsic being, in fulfilling its destiny, which is to sacrifice itself. It rids itself of the singleness which characterizes it, its merely self-centered enjoyment, and as such subordinated individuality. It is universality or essence. What it imports, what it gives to others, is being for self. It does not, however, give itself over as a nature that has no self, as the uncontrolled surrender of the condition of life, but as a self-conscious being in control of itself. It is not the inorganic power of the element that is known by the consciousness receiving it to be essentially transitory, but is the power over the self, the power that knows itself to be independent and arbitrary, and at the same time knows that what it dispenses is the self of another. Wealth thus shares its objection with the recipient. But in place of rebellion appears arrogance. For in one respect it knows as well as the recipient that being for self is a contingent thing, but it is itself this contingency in the power of which personality stands. In this arrogance, which fancies it has by the gift of a meal acquired the self or of another's I, and thereby gained for itself the submission of that other's inmost being, it overlooks the inner rebellion of the other. It overlooks the fact that all restraints have been cast off, overlooks the state of sheer disruption in which the self-identity of being for self, having become divided against itself, all identity, all existence is disrupted, and in which the sentiment and viewpoint of the benefactor suffer most distortion. It stands on the very edge of this innermost abyss, of this bottomless depth in which all stability and substance have vanished, and in this depth it sees nothing but a common thing, a plaything of its whims, an accident of its caprice. Its spirit is a subjective opinion, wholly devoid of essentiality, a superficiality from which spirit has fled. Just as self-consciousness had its own language with state power, in other words, just as spirit emerged as actively mediating between these extremes, so also has self-consciousness its own language in dealing with wealth, but still more so when it rebels. The language that gives wealth a sense of its essential significance and thereby gains possession of it, likewise the language of flattery, but of base flattery. For what it pronounces to be an essence it knows to be expendable, to be without any intrinsic being. The language of flattery, however, as we have already observed, is spirit that is still one-sided, for although its moments are indeed the self which has been refined by the discipline of service into a pure existence, and the intrinsic being of power, yet the pure notion in which the simple unitary self and the inner self, the former a pure I, and the latter the pure essence or thought, are the same. This unity of the two sides, which are in reciprocal relation, is not present in the consciousness that uses the language. The object is still for consciousness an intrinsic being in contrast to the self. That is, the object is not for consciousness at the same time consciousness's own self as such. The language of this disrupted consciousness is, however, the perfect language and the authentic existent spirit of this entire world of culture. This self-consciousness, which rebels against this rejection of itself, is eo ipso absolutely self-identical in its absolute disruption. The pure mediation of pure self-consciousness with itself, it is the sameness of the identical judgment in which one and the same personality is both subject and predicate. But this identical judgment is at the same time the infinite judgment, for this personality is absolutely derempted, and subject and predicate are utterly indifferent, immediate beings which have nothing to do with one another, which have no necessary unity, so much so that each is the power of a separate independent personality. The being for self of this consciousness has its own being for self for object as an out and out other, and yet, at the same time, directly as its own self, itself as another, not as if this had a different content. For the content is the same self in the form of an absolute antithesis and a completely indifferent existence of its own. Here, then, we have the spirit of this real world of culture, spirit that is conscious of itself in its truth and in its notion. It is this absolute and universal inversion and alienation of the actual world and of thought, its pure culture. What is learned in this world is that neither the actuality of power and wealth, nor their specific notions, good and bad, or the consciousness of good and bad, the noble and the ignoble consciousness, possess truth. On the contrary, all these moments become inverted, one changing into the other, and each is the opposite of itself. The universal power, which is the substance, when it acquires a spiritual nature of its own through the principle of individuality, receives its own self merely as a name, and though it is the actuality of power, is really the powerless being that sacrifices its own self, but this expendable, selfless being, or the self that has become a thing, is rather the return of that being into itself. It is being for self that is explicitly for itself, the concrete existence of spirit. The thoughts of these two essences of good and bad are similarly inverted in this movement, which is characterized as good is bad and vice versa. The consciousness of each of these moments, the consciousness judged as noble and ignoble, are rather in their truth just as much the reverse of what these characterizations are supposed to be. The noble consciousness is ignoble and repudiated, just as the repudiated consciousness is ignoble, just as the repudiated consciousness changes round into the nobility which characterizes the most highly developed freedom of self-consciousness. From a formal standpoint, everything is outwardly the reverse of what it is for itself, and again, it is not in truth what it is for itself, but something else than it wants to be. Being for self is rather the loss of itself, and its self-alienation rather the preservation of itself. What we have here, then, is that all the moments execute a universal justice on one another, each just as much alienates its own self as it forms itself into its opposite, and in this way inverts it. True spirit, however, is just this unity of the absolutely separate moments, and indeed it is just through the free actuality of these selfless extremes that, as their middle term, it achieves a concrete existence. It exists in the universal talk and destructive judgment, which strips of their significance all those moments which are supposed to count as the true being and as actual members of the whole, and is equally this nihilistic game which it plays with itself. This judging and talking is therefore what is true and invincible, while it overpowers everything. It is solely with this alone that one has truly to do with this actual world. In this world, the spirit of each part finds expression or is wittily talked about, and finds said about what it is. The honest individual takes each moment to be an abiding essentiality, and is the uneducated thoughtlessness of not knowing that it is equally doing the reverse. The disrupted consciousness, however, is conscious of the perversion, and moreover of the absolute perversion. What prevails in it is the notion, which brings together in a unity the thoughts which, in the honest individual, lie far apart, and its language is therefore clever and witty. The content of what spirit says about itself is thus the perversion of every notion and reality, the universal deception of itself and others, and the shamelessness which gives utterance to this deception is just for that reason the greatest truth. This kind of talk is the madness of the musician who heaped up and mixed together 30 arias, Italian, French, tragic, comic, of every sort. Now with a deep bass he descended into hell. Then, contracting his throat, he rent the vaults of heaven with a falsetto tone, frantic and soothed, imperious and mocking by turns. That's a quotation from Diderot. Rameau's nephew. To the tranquil consciousness, which in its honest way takes the melody of the good and the true to consist in the evenness of the notes, that is, in unison, this talk appears as a rigmarole of wisdom and folly, as a medley of as much skill as a baseness, of as many correct as false ideas, a mixture compounded of a complex perversion of sentiment, of absolute shamefulness, and of perfect frankness and truth. It will be unable to refrain from entering into all these tones and running up and down the entire scale of feelings, from the profoundest contempt and dejection to the highest pitch of admiration and emotion. But blended with the latter will be a tinge of ridicule which spoils them. Another quote from Rameau's nephew. The former, however, will find in their very frankness a strain of reconciliation, will find in their subversive depths the all-powerful note which restores spirit to itself. If we contrast with the speech of this mind, which is fully aware of its confused state, the speech of that simple consciousness of the true and the good, we find that in face of the frank and self-conscious eloquence of the educated mind, it can be no more than taciturn, for to the latter it can say nothing that it does not already know and say. If it gets beyond speaking in monosyllables, it says therefore the same thing that is said by the educated mind, but in doing so also commits the folly of imagining it is saying something new and different. Its very words, shameful, ignoble, are already this folly, for the other says them about itself. This latter mind perverts in its speech all that is unequivocal, because what is self-identical is only an abstraction, but in its actual existence is in its own self a perversion. The plain mind, on the other hand, takes under its protection the good and noble, that is, what retains its self-identity in its utterance, in the only way here possible, that is to say, the good does not lose its value because it may be associated or mixed with the bad, but this is its condition and necessity, and in this fact lies the wisdom of nature. Yet this plain mind, while it imagined it was contradicting what was said, has in doing so merely condensed into a trivial form the content of spirit's utterance, in making the opposite of the noble and good into the condition and necessity of the noble and good. It thoughtlessly supposes itself to be saying something else than that what is called noble and good is in its essence the reverse of itself, or that conversely the bad is the excellent. Raiding the king's cellar in Paris. Viva la Révolution. If the simple consciousness compensates for this dull, uninspired thought by the actuality of the excellent, by adducing an example of the latter, either in form or a fictitious case or a true story, thus showing that it is no empty name but actually exists, the universal actuality of the perverted action stands opposed to the whole of the real world, in which the said example constitutes something quite single and separate, an espèce, a mere sort of thing, and to represent the existence of the good and noble as an isolated anecdote, whether fictitious or true, is the most disparaging thing that can be said about it. Finally, should the plain mind demand the dissolution of this whole world of perversion, it cannot demand of the individual that he remove himself from it, for even Diogenes in his tub is conditioned by it, and to make this demand of the individual is just what is reckoned to be bad, namely to care for himself qua individual. But if the demand for this removal is directed to the universal individuality, it cannot mean that a reason should give up against the spiritual developed consciousness. Give up again the spiritual developed consciousness it has acquired, should submerge the widespread wealth of its moments again in the simplicity of the natural heart, and relapse into the wilderness of the nearly animal consciousness, which is also called nature or innocence. On the contrary, the demand for this dissolution can only be dissected to the spirit of culture itself, in order that it return out of its confusion to itself as spirit, and win for itself a still higher consciousness. But in point of fact, spirit has already accomplished this in principle. The consciousness that is aware of its disruption and openly declares it, divides existence and the universal confusion, and divides its own self as well. It is at the same time the fading but still audible sound of all this confusion, this vanity of all reality and every definite notion, vanity which knows itself to be such, is the double reflection of the real world into itself. Once in this particular self of consciousness, qua particular, and again in the pure universality of consciousness, or in thought, in the first case, spirit that has come to itself has directed its gaze to the world of actuality, and still has there its purpose and immediate content. But in the other case, its gaze is in part turned only inward and negatively against it, and in part is turned away from that world towards heaven, and its object is the beyond of this world. In that aspect of the return into the self, the vanity of all things is its own vanity. It is itself vain, it is the self-centered self that knows not only how to pass judgment on and chatter about everything, but how to give witty expression to the contradiction that is present in the solid elements of the actual world, as also in the fixed determinations posited by judgment. And this contradiction is their truth. Looked at from the point of view of form, it knows everything to be self-alienated. Being for self is separated from being in itself. What is meant on purpose are separated from truth and from both again. The being for another, the ostensible meaning from the real meaning, from the truth and intention. Thus it knows how to give correct expression to each moment in relation to its opposite. In general, how to express accurately the perversion of everything. It knows better than each what each is, no matter what its specific nature is. Since it knows the substantial form, the side of the disunion and conflict which are united within the substantial itself, but not from the side of this union, it understands very well how to pass judgment on it, but has lost the ability to comprehend it. This vanity at the same time needs the vanity of all things in order to get from them the consciousness of itself, of self. It therefore creates this vanity itself, and is the soul that supports it. Power and wealth are the supreme ends of its exertions. It knows that through renunciation and sacrifice it forms itself into the universal, attains to the possession of it, and in this possession is universally recognized and accepted. State power and wealth are the real and acknowledged powers. However, the recognition and acceptance of itself are vain, and just by taking possession of power and wealth, it knows them to be without a self of their own, knows rather that it is the power over them, while they are vain things, the fact that in possessing them is itself apart from and beyond them is exhibited in its witty talk, which is therefore its supreme interest and the truth of the whole relationship. In such talk, this particular self, qua this pure self, determined neither by reality nor by thought, develops into a spiritual self that is truly universal worth. It is the self-disruptive nature of all relationships and the conscious disruption of them, but only as self-consciousness in revolt is it aware of its own disrupted state, and in thus knowing it has immediately risen above it. In that vanity all content is turned into something negative which can no longer be grasped as having a positive significance. The positive object is merely the pure I itself, and the disrupted consciousness in itself, this pure self-identity of self-consciousness that has returned to itself.